the judge's decision is in, that's you, and it looks like you thought Richard III was... Hey everyone, Dr. Paul here, just wrapping things up from last week's fight, where our actors battled it out over Richard III. Do we play him as an all-out villain or as a complex, quasi-sympathetic character who's out to get the crown come hell or high water? To present him as a textbook villain might run the risk of making him one-dimensional. But to interpret him as complex and sympathetic might end up in us aligning ourselves with a butcher and a rapist. Well, the judge's decision is in, that's you, and it looks like you thought Richard III was a butcher and a rapist. Thanks for sharing your decision in the comments. If you missed that video, just click on the link that's popped up on the screen. The question of Richard III's nature, or nurture, came out of me wondering how to stage a play that features an arguably sympathetic sexual predator when we live in the age of consent. Our fearless actors gave us some great arguments as a starting place, which I'd like to just fill out a little bit more here. What I'm wondering is, what do we do with Richard III in the Me Too era? As far as I'm concerned, we still have to stage this play. It's too spectacular to chuck out on account of us living in a more enlightened age as regards women's good, bad, and downright ugly encounters with sex. But can we watch Lady Anne consent to marry Richard III and Queen Elizabeth say that she'll try to talk her daughter into doing the same without making Richard a less handsome Don Juan, who, by the way, was a serial rapist himself? I think we can, but I don't think that's what Shakespeare wanted. So I guess on this one, I'm going to have to say, who cares, Willie? Out with the old, in with me too. Here's why I think Shakespeare wanted us to be attracted to Richard III, though probably not sexually. Shakespeare seems to have been pretty trained on the maniacal king's charisma. Was he trying to make him sympathetic? Probably. Maybe a little, maybe a lot. He does this with his villains. Keep watching these videos in Shakespeare in the Ring and you'll see lots of these complex characters pop up. At the very least, he seems to want us to go home thinking about Richard III more than about the guy that succeeds him as king. Sure, his successor seems to have put a lid on the violent infighting relatives who keep the nation steeped in civil war. But who was it that killed Richard III? Do you even remember? Probably not, and that's because Henry, Earl of Richmond, is boring and kind of a prig. By contrast, Richard III is hugely memorable right down to the last act where he is haunted nearly to the death by the souls of all the people that he has killed. He's in a wild theatrical sweat, and when he's not plagued by ghosts, he's decimated by his own conscience. In a crazy psychic battle, this villainous king finally crushes his own flashes of integrity. Running totally on adrenaline, Richard III prepares to meet his foes on Bosworth Field. Meanwhile, on the other side of the stage, literally, Henry is having the sleep of his life, assured that he is blessed by God to take down the last king of the House of York. So, Richard III, as he starts out of his sleep, is all, my conscience has 1,000 tongues and every tongue condemns me for a villain. All my sins are plaguing me and everybody hates me, and if I die, no soul will pity me. And Henry, Earl of Richmond, is all like, oh yes, yes, I slept like a baby. Snooze. Then he fights a lot, constantly reminding everyone who wants to listen to him that God is definitely on his side, and then he becomes king. No real pomp, No real ceremony, just a whole lot of assurances that everything is going to be okay. End of story. Literally. Shakespeare writes about Henry IV, Henry V, 3 plays about Henry VI, and 1 about Henry VIII. But this guy, Henry, Earl of Richmond, who becomes Henry VII, doesn't even get a single second in the spotlight after the Battle of Bosworth. His reign was relatively boring, so he doesn't get a play. Richard III, by contrast, is a lot of things, and most of them, in fact, pretty much all of them, totally terrible. But he is never, ever boring. He is a messed up, maniacal, predatorial, multi-dimensional, fully alive, capital V villain, and we will never forget him. All that said, I frankly don't think I'd enjoy a production any longer that asked us to sympathize with a man who coerces women into having sex with him. And there are actually lots of those productions. A not too distant production, well, in a not too distant past, is Sam Mendes' modern dress production in 2011 with that other alleged sexual predator, Kevin Spacey, in the title role. The script actually inserts a monologue from another play, Henry VI Part 3, to fuel our sympathies for this manipulative soon-to-be King Richard. And we watch his sexual charisma unfurl on stage as a helpless Lady Anne falls willingly into his clutches. The monologue from Henry VI Part 3 explains that he was born legs first and with teeth, and that since the heavens shaped his body thus, hell should complement it with a crooked mind. He laments that he has no father or brother, and that he does not know what it means to love. Just in case I wasn't clear, the production actually added this in from another play to make us feel sympathy for Richard III. So producers and directors take all kinds of liberties with Shakespeare's plays. But you don't even have to play with the text much or at all to produce a play in which Richard III is a fully loathsome sex offender. Donna Lee Ford argued this persuasively last week. Carrie Vandergrind, in the other corner, tried to say, yes, but Shakespeare manages to make us sympathize. He gave this cool example about Richard III speaking to us as confidants several times in his opening monologue, and that this makes us complicit in his scheming. But just because he talks to us doesn't mean we have to like him or even get him. And it looks like he maybe picks up this "we're just not that into you" vibe because he never does it again after the first act. For the rest of the play, we get to see him being the child-killing, family-killing, wife-raping murderer that he is. And as for making the women in the play seem irresistibly attracted to this devil king, let's just think about that a little more. It seems like productions like Kevin Spacey's are taking some major liberties with the text, and that would be okay if they didn't seem to be promoting the idea that women like having sex with predatorial men. There are only 2 potentially problematic scenes featuring women and consent in a play with 25 scenes. As long as Anne and Queen Elizabeth, the female characters in those scenes, are cowed by him and bullied into their consent, then there's no reason that we can't present him as a truly monstrous 100% villain. All of the time. Don't forget, most of the time we see how the women in this play hate him, including the 2 that give in to his advances. And then there's Queen Margaret. She's the widow of Henry VI, who Richard murders in the Tower of London in the 3rd part of Henry VI, which came before Richard III. She sees right through him. And I feel like we should take our cue from her advice. She says, "Look, when he fawns, he bites. And when he bites, his venom tooth will rankle to the death. Have naught to do with him. Beware of him. Sin, death, and hell have their marks on him, and all their ministers attend on him." If directors want to focus on his sexual charisma, they're looking for material that's barely there. The play mostly shows how much he hates women. For example, of Lady Anne, he says, "I'll have her, but I will not have her long." And he calls Queen Elizabeth a relenting fool and shallow, changing woman. This is after he's referred to her as that monstrous witch. To focus on his sexual magnetism in the age of consent is not only far-flung, it's downright dangerous. Well, that concludes my thoughts on Richard III. Thanks so much for listening in. Be sure to join me next week when my fearless actors fight it out over two of the most scheming, selfish, and dangerous characters in Shakespeare, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth.